Welcome to yet another episode of the NewSpace India podcast. As companies are trying to build their own rockets and satellites today in India, it brings a plethora of new challenges in terms of space policies and laws that govern their activities. So far, since ISRO has been building launch vehicles and satellites by themselves, and essentially ISRO is a government entity, all the responsibilities and risks and liabilities fall back to the government, and there need not be any specific rules set since a government body is entirely responsible for it, and any liabilities or risks are taken care of by the government itself. However, now that private actors are looking to do this, it becomes the responsibility of the government to ensure that they are conducting activities safely, and at the same time, it also becomes their responsibility to provide these companies an umbrella under which they can operate without any fear. In this episode of the NewSpace India podcast, I chat with my friend Ashok, who is one of the foremost space lawyers in India, about how legal is it to build satellites and rockets in India. This is a long and an unwinding conversation that might give you an overview of the challenges that entrepreneurs are facing in terms of uncertainty in space law and policy, which has to be addressed by the newly formed InSpace. Ashok is a lawyer based in Bangalore and is a partner at a firm called Factum Law. He's authored multiple papers, including ones with me, on space law and policy, and has been working with several new space companies based in India. I hope that this episode throws a lot of knowledge to any upcoming entrepreneurs who are looking to build rockets and satellites out of India. This is almost like a masterclass from a space lawyer who goes into all the intricacies when it comes to issues around building satellites and rockets out of India. Ashok, welcome to this episode of the NewSpace India podcast.
Thank you for having me, NP.
So Ashok, we have known each other for a while, and I know you are one of the most brilliant lawyers in India who have done extensively your own research in the space industry. And in fact, I've been on many panels with you talking about many of these issues, and I thought we should take some time in recording an episode which may touch upon all the things that companies have to take care while doing business in India in the space industry. So let's actually begin by going directly into what happens if somebody wants to build rockets in India. So companies like Agnikul, like Skyroot are all planning to build these launch vehicles out of India. What are the policies and laws that govern these companies, private companies, and what is necessary for them to be successful?
Excellent question, NP. So first and foremost, for those listening in, I have to also make a mention that the very first paper that I co-authored on space policy was actually with you. So in many ways, I actually consider you a mentor in the space law industry. So thank you for that. Coming to the question of what it takes to be a launch service provider or building a launch vehicle in the country, I think we have to understand that the law has it's eons behind contemplating regulations for say a SpaceX in the country. Take a smaller problem statement, which could be model rocketry. The Explosives Act, which governs to some extent the nature of the propulsions used in rocket technology, is yet to be updated, and it is so draconian in its approach that essentially a person who wants to build a launch technology has to start at the very bottom by just trying to convince people that his intentions are good and that the design is not intended to harm the national interests of the country. It's not intended to aid or enable terrorist activities against the country. So there is a tremendous amount of a lack of preparation on the part of policy to address a launch vehicle developer as such. That said, if there is sufficient buy-in from the government, a lot of these hurdles can be easily overcome. But in the absence of that buy-in from the government, and if it is a case where the technology for launch is being developed by a private sector player for a private sector customer without the intervention of the government, regulations are a long distance away before we can we can see our own answer to SpaceX emerging in India.
So let's look at SpaceX or even the US and other geographies. What bodies govern activities of SpaceX, and what would be the equivalent of that in India?
So the advantage of the US jurisdiction is that I think it's always been an economy that is very oriented or focused towards supporting entrepreneurship and to kind of nurture private enterprises to enter into these activities. So if you look at the Commercial Space Launch Act of 1984, it is actually quite interesting for our problem statement, because what it does is it does not give NASA the power to regulate transport to space and back. The mandate to regulate space transport is actually with the Department of Transport in the United States. So they took an extremely logical and a very practical approach to regulating launch vehicle services or launch services in general, by bringing it within the scope of the Office of Transport as opposed to bringing it within the scope of NASA. So essentially what they did was that they segregated the regulatory function for a launch service provider from the actual participatory function of the space agency. I think if today we are in a situation where NASA is actively working with and supporting a SpaceX, it's perhaps owing to the fact that as early as 1984, the United States actually decided that they will make a serious push and a serious policy decision as such to kind of favor private launch service providers to enter into the industry. The other interesting facet is that as part of the very same law, which is the Commercial Space Launch Act, there is actually very well defined regulations on what terms and conditions a SpaceX or a private sector enterprise can hope to gain access to governmental facilities. So that kind of clarity allows for a very well planned costing exercise where a private sector enterprise knows what it needs to do to be able to get access to critical facilities needed to develop a launch vehicle or a launch service. So I think just in terms of how early they foresaw the vision for a private sector enterprise entering into the sector, and the kind of very serious policy changes they brought about, I think today the success story of a SpaceX can be squarely attributed to that kind of vision and policy, and that kind of meaningful action in terms of developing policies itself.
Let's take the example of a company like a Skyroot or Bellatrix or Agnikul, one of these companies, and look at the life cycle of them and look at what policies affect them, right? So if I am a company like that, I am trying to maybe firstly demonstrate one of the stages on the ground, or some of the thrusters or engines that are there on the ground. So even at that level, do these companies have enough legal framework allowing them to do this activity?
Well, so that goes back to the problem statement, right? Which is that the laws of the land are so ambiguous and are so opaque. So if I have to take, for example, a Bellatrix that's kind of looking to develop some propulsion technology for the space program, the design itself is probably less of a hurdle, because I think for them to be able to come up with the right kind of designs for the technology is not so problematic. But the moment it comes to actually testing those designs by manufacturing a prototype, to put it very crudely, just making sure that the fuel for the propulsion technology goes into the prototype, and then it's allowed to kind of test itself in a facility, the nature of clearances they will require is going to be quite significant, because there's a fat chance that the Explosives Act will come in the way, and the very first hurdle will be to just go to the regulators under the Explosives Act and see if they're willing to either give a waiver on some of the requirements to set up the facility, or at least come back with an updated set of regulations. I mean, the last I checked, the nature of regulations prescribed for what kind of testing facilities can be used for testing within quotes explosive devices, it required one set of regulations required that the testing facility should have wooden structures. When we have composite materials in today's day and age, which actually enables us to test under more safer circumstances, it's anybody's guess as to why the regulations haven't been updated. So just in terms of getting the clearances to even test the prototype that they have is going to be a significant challenge. And then the next challenge is that even if I develop a successful technology and the prototype clears all my testing protocols and I realize that it's fit for use, the law itself does not tell me whether I can or cannot provide launch services as a private sector operator. So this gives rise to two questions, right? I can either interpret this opaqueness in the law to state that what is not specifically prohibited is permitted, which is what one sector of the industry is interpreting this legal position as, or it could be another interpretation which says that what is not expressly permitted is probably prohibited. So these questions really don't have any clear answers at this point of time. But the advantage, or to offset this policy opaqueness, one strategy would be to try and engage with the official agency of the government itself, which is the ISRO. And I think that kind of a partnership with the government can offset some of the uncertainties created by this kind of an opaque policy situation. But in the absence of that buy-in with the government, everything from just being able to source the propulsions necessary or to manufacture the propulsion agent necessary and to just test it out itself is going to be quite a challenge. And even if you manage to clear that phase somehow, being able to answer the question as to whether I can commercialize my propulsion technology, I mean, that's a huge problem statement. And as a lawyer, I don't think I'll ever be able to, with the present policy landscape, put my signature on a piece of paper that says you can or cannot do it, because unfortunately the policies are simply not that clear.
So I have a hypothetical question here, or maybe even a real question in that sense. If I have built something that I want to test, in my garage or whatever, as a stage or a engine or whatever it is, if I go out and do that test by myself in India, would I be breaking a law as of today?
There's a more than reasonable chance that you're violating the Explosives Act in the process. So heaven forbid, if you were to be caught doing an exercise of this nature, you could potentially be facing criminal liability, including perhaps imprisonment and penalties and whatnot. So I mean, as a lawyer, since we are on record, my advice to you is to not do that. I mean, it comes down to that, right?
Yeah, that's the challenge, right? So because a lot of these companies are trying to now build up and perhaps even at any moment can try to do some tests. I also saw some igniter test videos from some of them, and of course the question is at what level this becomes extremely serious, and it will become extremely serious if there is a mishap.
So I think that's been the basic facet of Indian policy making till date. It's always been to swing in the extremes. So if you look at any kind of emerging technologies in the country, it's a case where things are largely left unregulated for a really long time. And that kind of also incentivizes people to become imaginative and become creative and really innovate and bring a new technology to the forefront. But the moment the regulators contemplate a worst case scenario or a worst case scenario actually materializes, then the policy just swings in the exact opposite direction, and suddenly you have a whole bunch of over regulations that you have to deal with. To give you a simple example or an analogy to kind of explain this, for the longest of time, India was a very attractive destination for clinical trial of drugs because the policy was reasonably worded, and the enforcement record was not particularly problematic for the industry. So India became a favorite destination to actually conduct clinical trials because on one hand you have a excellent available pool of talent. On the other hand, you also have regulations that don't seem to come in the way of innovation in the healthcare industry. But all it took was one single public interest litigation before the Supreme Court regarding some of the alleged violation of clinical trial ethics in the country. And overnight, the regulations pertaining to clinical trials became so much more stringent. There was so much more accountability. And by some estimates, clinical trial rate in the country dropped by as high as almost 80-85% after these regulations changed. So I think that's been a problem feature of our nation's policy making, especially not just when it comes to space industry, but I think in general, we always swing in the extremes. And the problem of either under regulation or over regulation is that it's not really fulfilling the requirements of the industry or the market, because under regulation creates uncertainty and over regulation creates the kind of certainty which makes your business model unviable. So I think somewhere we need to be able to draw a balance between the two extremes, because with the current landscape, you are just incentivizing people to experiment with the policy a little more. You're incentivizing dangerous behavior. You're incentivizing lack of statutory oversight. So it almost makes it synonymous that it almost makes it seem like to be synonymous with business success, you probably need to let regulations and policy take a backseat. So that's not the message that you want to be sending out if you want to attract investment into the industry. So you're absolutely right. I think we really need to reflect on our culture towards policy making, especially for emerging technologies in the field of space, and come back with something that is realistic, promotes innovation, reduces the hurdles to doing business, but at the same time not permit the current state of under regulation to continue because of the uncertainties it creates.
So let's talk a little bit on the more positive side of all of this. I think this is already quite gloomy in that sense. What can ISRO do that can help an Agnikul or a Skyroot to be successful? So today, Shar, the Sriharikota island and the complex that has a launch vehicle operating out of it, there's of course the area is quite massive. They have like 3 launch pads, 2, and then the third one maybe fully now constructed or so on. And also there's a second spaceport that is up and coming. So doesn't it make logical sense that there's a consultation process where some of these companies can come in and then they say that they're going to pay a rent to use a particular portion of the spaceport for themselves, so that there's no disruption of ISRO's facilities, and these companies can kind of invest their own money to create a launch pad or something like that, where ISRO doesn't need to bother about investing taxpayers' money to support these people, if that is a workable model.
So I think that's a fabulous that would be a fabulous approach if we can just get that kind of collaboration going with the official wing of the Indian state when it comes to space programs. And to the credit of the ISRO, I think they did make they have created an excellent ecosystem of vendors that have been kind of catering to ISRO space missions. But as you yourself have pointed out, there's really no IP creation in this vendor ecosystem or this vendor supply chain. So I think if ISRO were to come back with 2 things, right? One is a clear policy in terms of how their facilities can be accessed by a private sector player, and the terms and conditions of the grant of access to such facilities. What are the potential costs? What are the application criteria that will be applicable when you're applying for the grant to the facility? I think that's one leg of it. But what ISRO could do is to also structure a proper incubation program where startups or companies that are interested to develop launch technologies can actually benefit from the mentorship of ISRO, can actually partner with the scientists from the ISRO, and generally just also create that level of trust between what the private sector has to offer and the concerns of the official wing of the Indian state. I think if you're just able to create this culture of working together, I think to a large extent what you will see is that the trust factor will improve. And as the trust factor improves, you will see the space open up more and more for private sector enterprises to kind of assume some of these functions, including conducting launches instead of letting it be the problem of the official wing of the Indian government. So I think there is a lot of potential for ISRO to liberalize its policies, to collaborate with the private sector, make policies for how its facilities can be accessed, develop a more collaborative program through incubation of the startups. There is a ton of potential there, and from what I've heard, I think ISRO is quite serious about it. So I look forward to what is possible or what will happen in the days to come, especially with all the reforms that have been recently announced.
Yeah, to be honest with you, the view that I can take of, let's say, from the ISRO side of it is they would want to not have a company that is inexperienced, blow up any of its own facilities. So that's a fair, point to take in mind, I would suppose. And in that sense, therefore, just giving out empty space within the spaceport that is not attached to any of its own infrastructure, maybe the best way to kind of do it, where they don't really care what happens there, and then it's very contained, because none of these companies are planning to build rockets of the size of Saturn V or something. It's much smaller, and then they would need a much smaller area, and ultimately it's just making sure that they have access to such an area and such a facility where they can do such experiments in a place where people are not around or can be hurt in the process.
Absolutely. So, look, I mean, the concern is really about the credibility, right? So, if, for example, tomorrow a very young company run by a bunch of people without any credentials in the space industry were to come back and say that I want to work with potentially explosive substances, I want to develop rocket technology which has a whole bunch of national security concerns associated with it. The state is bound to have some concerns around it, and I think those concerns are quite reasonable to expect. That said, I think rather than just putting a hard stop right at those concerns, what is possible is for us to develop a very layered approach to letting a company or a startup of that nature make inroads into the industry. Because if there is passion and if there is that drive towards creating innovation in this field, you would much rather incubate them within the supervision and the mentorship of an experienced space organization like ISRO, rather than letting them go out there in the big wide world where they probably won't be as regulated or under as much oversight. So, and we know now that private sector involvement in this is inevitable. I mean, throughout the world, we are seeing, SpaceX is not the only company out there, right? You have a whole bunch of other startups and private sector players wanting to enter into the industry. So when we know that this end game is real, that there is going to be greater private sector participation in launch activities, the pragmatic thing to do is to bring them within the fold of the government, so that you can provide the startups and companies with your expertise and experience. You can develop the right kind of policies and methods to kind of validate some of these technologies being developed, the credibility and the credentials of the people developing these technologies. And if everything goes well, it's a win-win situation. The state has now managed to create an entire value chain in the private industry, and at the same time the lack of experience and the regulatory concerns that the private industry might have is offsetted by the support and the mentorship of a veteran organization like the ISRO. So I genuinely feel that rather than focusing too much on the problem, which is perhaps the nascent nature of some of these companies, the focus must actually be towards trying to find a way where we become the platform on which these startups build their experience and build their credibility and get the validation of what they're actually doing.
Absolutely, and the other part of all of this is also that a lot of the companies can actually use the ground facilities, the telemetry and tracking stations that ISRO has, the control center related knowledge, or even the integration of the control center to their own, launch vehicles. So those are all the co-investments that have already been made in the country, which they can leverage to kind of, alleviate the investment needed in their own systems, and then look at becoming operational and profitable as quickly as possible.
Absolutely. So, which is why I said I think this is an excellent way of ensuring that it's a win-win situation for everyone concerned. Because I mean, let's face it, if you want to build your own tracking and telemetry facility in this country, the regulatory hoops that you'll have to jump through is not a joke. It is a significant investment just in terms of the technical infrastructure, the land, but then it's also quite a bit of a challenge to be able to just get the right kind of clearances and certifications for such a facility. So I think there is a tremendous value proposition that comes with just working with the state as opposed to working independent of the state. And my advice to anybody from the private sector will be to look at the state as an ally. I understand that there have been some uncertainties and there have been some difficulties in terms of getting clear answers as to what the way forward is. But all said and done, the only sustainable method of trying to find a foothold in the space industry when you're in India is to ensure that you and the ISRO actually work collaboratively. And I think especially with the recent policy announcements and greater emphasis on private sector participation, I am thinking that relationship is going to get easier, the journey is going to get more robust, and we will see greater collaborations that enable the private industry to really benefit from the existing experience and the facilities that are out there.
Or that's at least the hope.
That's the hope, yes.
So there are two other pieces that comes to launch vehicles that I can think of which are interesting. One is insurance, because I think most countries that have private launch vehicles operating in them, the state actually sets an insurance level to which the company has to take out insurance, and then beyond that the state ensures any damages being paid out by the state itself. And so that is one bit. The other is coordination between the private launch vehicles and the government for in terms of clearance of the flight. So it could be clearing the airspace and clearing the ocean and things like that.
Right. So I think again it just goes back to the same problem statement, right? Which is if, for example, we need to bring in insurance for launch vehicle developers or launch service providers in the country, with the present market the way it is, it's and I'm just speaking as a complete layperson here. The market being what it is today in the country, it's probably not the most attractive market for insurance companies to start providing insurance services for launch developers or launch service providers, because there's just not so many people actually doing that kind of work in the country. So and the other problem is that if you're looking to attract insurance into this industry, the question is what is the potential liability that the insurance service provider has to kind of address or cover as part of the insurance policy. So in one of the more recent panels that I was in, Purvi Kantru, who's a doctoral candidate from NALSA, she brought up a very important point, that a lot of countries, like including the US and the UK, they actually cap the liability arising out of a space activity at a certain amount. So the insurance company knows that this is the extent of coverage that is required to be provided, because anything beyond the cap is going to be taken care of through the state, or at least it's not the responsibility of the insurance holder. But because our policies are yet to kind of come out on these subjects, and even the Space Activities Bill does not yet contemplate a cap on liability, insurance is going to be a bit of a problem, because for any insurance service provider, when liabilities are uncertain and there isn't enough of a sizable market, it becomes a very difficult business decision to make to really step in and provide insurance for an activity of this nature. But that said, it is really not, it's going to be quite unreasonable to expect the state to actually just give a platform for private launch vehicle providers to start doing business without insurance being involved, because then it's essentially up to the state entirely to kind of cover the liability that comes out of it, and that's not an attractive proposition for the state as well. So I think the only way to address the conundrum is for the policy to come out with a clear cap on the potential liability arising out of a launch activity, and to ensure that we provide the right kind of incentives for insurance companies to really come into the country and provide the kind of support necessary for launch vehicle developers or launch service providers. And if despite all this effort we still see that gap, then it's not a bad idea for the Indian government to itself come back with a way to ensure some of the government-run insurance companies start providing these services. I think that could be the strongest statement of policy support for launch vehicle developers or launch service providers in the country. When the state comes back and says that don't worry about going to the private sector, our own insurance companies will actually take care of you. So in an ideal world, I think that's what we could expect. So let's see. I think if you're really serious about becoming self-sufficient and indigenization and make in India, I certainly see and hope that we will see a culture of that nature emerge in the days to come.
Absolutely, and even for the airspace clearance and the traditional note to airman and NOTAM and things like that, there's I think the process can be easily be replicated also in the private industry by just using the same process that ISRO does, but applying it to the private industry.
Absolutely. So, which again goes back to my point about the importance of ensuring that the private industry develops under the blessings of the ISRO and the state. Because what happens then is that the state need not develop a separate set of protocols for the private sector to follow in terms of getting clearances of airspace and ensuring clearance of maritime areas and all of that. Because those protocols are already in place for ISRO, and all that needs to then happen is to trigger those protocols. But if we end up forcing the industry to develop independent of the ISRO, then it also means that we have to develop the same kind of protocols that the US has, which is you have a Department of Transport that regulates the actual launch activity. Then you have the Federal Aviation Commission, which will then step in to ensure that airspace is cleared. So it just creates another layer of regulatory headaches for both the industry as well as the government. So bringing it within the scope of the ISRO also means that you have credible technology that's developing under the watchful eyes of the most experienced operator in the industry, and two, just in terms of safety and clearances, you can ensure that the new players in the market are still coming within the scope of the existing protocols without having to provoke a separate set of policies and protocols to evolve. So I think there is a lot of incentive for the state to just ensure that this happens under the aegis of and under their own blessings rather than forcing it to happen independent of them.
So let's say that none of these takes place in the meantime in the next few years. Let's assume that none of these reforms are put into place for the time being, and some of these companies are matured in terms of their technology, and they have matured in terms of their product and even testing, and ultimately they need to rely on launching out of other countries that have more sustainable and also maybe more certain framework for them to provide their service out of. How will that impact their operations in India, and is that even legal for that matter?
So that really depends on the specific nature of the supply chain around the product development itself, right? So for example, if say a couple of one or two Indian promoters manage to collaborate with say one or two people from say Singapore, and then they set up a company in Singapore which will design and develop and manufacture launch technology. Honestly, at that point of time, it's in today's globalized world, to prevent that kind of an eventuality from happening is almost next to impossible, because we are seeing now that businesses can be incorporated in other countries in a span of 24 to 48 to 72 hours. And if it's something as abstract and as intangible as say designing or developing a design of a launch vehicle, or a launch technology, you can move out in a matter of 1 week and start developing your design abroad, and the country loses in the process, because what could have been a technology beneficial for the country is now happening somewhere else. Now, but if it is a case where you're developing the launch relevant technology in the country, and the prototypes or the manufactured products are sought to be exported to a different country, then there are export control regulations that come into the picture. So you need to get the appropriate clearances, which becomes quite a bit of a headache, because then you have to not only convince the government of your own credibility, but you also need to convince the government of the credibility of the customer to whom this technology is being sent out. That then raises a separate set of problems. So, and today's day and age, it's also quite common for say an Indian business in a non-security relevant domain, like say food products or say oil and natural gas drilling industry, to actually sell to a customer in Pakistan, not directly, but setting up an offshore entity in say Dubai, and then routing the transaction to the customer in say a rival country like Pakistan. So in a non-security relevant industry, that becomes easier. But if it is a security relevant industry, which is what launch technology is all about, I wouldn't advise it, because potentially you are looking at aiding and abetting the enemy country's actions against your own country. So without the appropriate clearances and notifications to the Indian government, you could fall into serious trouble. So it's really a question of whether you want to move the design activity abroad or whether you want to just export the technology abroad. I think design activity abroad will probably be not as problematic, provided you don't sell your security sensitive designs to an enemy country. But if you're looking to manufacture the product within and then take it out of the country, export regulations will be a significant area of concern, and it won't be easy. So that those legalities will be much harder to grapple with.
I believe that some of these companies can be mature in terms of the product development, but ultimately they may face the bottleneck in actually testing their hardware out in India, or testing their entire launch vehicle out in India without the preparation of the ground for them. And I guess that is what many other launch vehicle companies are also looking at in many other geographies as well, where they're looking at using spaceports in, let's say, the UK or US or Norway or some places like that, where these legal frameworks are being developed for uh, companies from countries which don't have them, and essentially providing the spaceport access for them as a commercial service for them to then operate the launch vehicle out of. So in that case, let's say a company in India is using the Indian supply chain and the IP that they've designed and developed in India, and they're producing the rocket using the supply chain primarily, let's say, from India. But ultimately, the rocket is kind of being exported, and maybe the final assembly of it is done in a third country and then operated out of there.
See, I think the advantage of Norway over, say, in India is that their geopolitical context is significantly more favorable for these kind of sensitive technologies to be really incubated and developed. Our problem statement is just the location and the neighboring context that we have to constantly grapple with. We have China on one side, we have Pakistan on the other, and these days with even Nepal is becoming a little bit of a sensitive issue. So for a potential business that is looking to develop technologies regulated by export control, and which includes launch technology, being in a pacifist country like, say, Switzerland or Norway certainly has advantages, because security is probably not going to be as problematic as it is going to be in a country like India, where these kind of security considerations are very legitimate and they're very relevant. But the flip side of all of this is that while India may still justify this for the right reason, saying that this is absolutely critical for a national technology imperative, our national security imperative, the only problem is that we are driving innovation to go out of the country. So so the long term losses to us is probably quite significant. And while ISRO will continue to be at the forefront of India's innovation in this sector, we don't want to discourage Indians from being in India when they do this work. So while, yeah, the practical solution is to probably go to a country like Norway and do this work there, I think it would be wise for the Indian government to actually come back and prevent that from happening and ensure that there's a mature market for that right in the country. Because we want to ensure that the trend or the pattern of brain drain doesn't affect space technology, because that would be quite unfortunate.
I think we had quite a long chat on the rocket part of all of this, and there may be more such uncertainties to address. But for now, I think let's switch topics to a satellite manufacturer and look at the facets of what affects them at the moment. So as of today, there's only possibly one company that has designed and put together its own satellite in space in India as a private entity, which is Exceed Space or Satellites, and other companies are planning to do so. What are the main bottlenecks you think for a company that wants to build satellites and basically sell them, not provide services on top of them, but basically building these satellites for some people who want these satellites and then putting it out in the orbit? What are the main restrictions at the moment for them to operate out of India?
So if I have to, again, from a layperson's perspective, just divide the entire life cycle of a satellite product, in terms of just designing a satellite, putting together the satellite in the country and just making it ready for launch, I think India is a very good market to work with because your manufacturing costs are low. You have enough access to a talent pool. So just getting the product ready is not very difficult. I think the problem is that if you want to really launch the satellite out of the country, because let's take for example you're a startup and you have you're looking at developing a nano satellite or a CubeSat. Getting access to a launch vehicle within the country, which would be the GSLV or the PSLV, would automatically come at a significant cost, and not just the cost of the launch, but then you also have a GST component that will immediately hit you because as the customer you are in the country, the launch service provider is within the country, therefore there's an immediate 18% GST levy on it. And if you are able to somehow get the satellite up in space and are able to provide commercial services within the Indian market, you can perhaps look at offsetting the GST liability onto your output services. But if you're looking to just do this as a prototype test case, or you're just looking at it as a research and development exercise for your technology, that 18% GST paid to Antrix or ISRO for the launch services is essentially gone. I mean, there's no way to offset it in terms of just a tax credit. So the significant hurdle would be the launch process, which is quite expensive, and not to mention the fact that there's a GST liability around it. And the GST liability is not what a foreign customer has to face while working with ISRO, because then it's treated as an export of service. So it's a very bizarre situation where the policy actually favors foreign customers better than the customers in India. I mean, this is compliance of the bilateral investment treaties at a different level altogether. The only other flip side is that suppose you're able to somehow absorb the cost of the GST, absorb the cost of the launch, and you're able to get your satellite up in orbit. The next problem is to be able to provide services using that in the country. So let's take for example that Earth observation is the objective of your satellite in space. The problem with Earth observation satellites right now is that trading remote sensing data in the country is heavily regulated under the remote sensing data policy, and you can only do it through the official channels of the National Remote Sensing Center of the ISRO. So there's really no market-based approach to trading in remote sensing data. So which means that your ability to sell the images your satellite is generating is going to be quite problematic. And if you're looking to provide, say, satellite communication services, for that, just getting a hold on the orbit is challenging because you don't know. There are two levels of regulation involved. One is a wireless planning and coordination wing, which in turn has to coordinate with the International Telecommunication Union for your orbit, and then getting access to the spectrum that you need to talk to your bird in the sky. So all those involve significant areas of concern. So developing the product is the least of all the problems. You can actually quite easily build a satellite in the next 1 or 2 months. But the problem is just to be able to launch it and then to be able to provide services using that satellite. Those are the two areas you're going to face a significant amount of policy uncertainties and hurdles. And if there are uncertainties at the end of that life cycle, then it doesn't incentivize the design and development and launch itself. So just speaking in terms of a satellite manufacturer, I think you would much rather just be a vendor that builds to a specification and then gets a certain X amount of money for that, and you end up giving the product to the eventual operator and tell him that it's his headache to get orbit, it's his headache to get launch, it's his headache to get spectrum, and it's his headache to get the service license necessary to actually commercialize that satellite. So, but yeah, I mean, development and manufacture is not the problem. I think the problem is what follows afterwards.
Yeah, and some of these underlying issues are also non-ISRO related because you talked about the usage of spectrum, and in that case, it's the relationship that the Department of Telecommunication has with the Department of Space, and even there are some problems just within the government in itself because, for example, I think S-band spectrum in India for space is heavily only provided to the military as a defense utilization, and commercial usage of S-band spectrums from space is almost not possible in the country. And that has many implications for any operator that wants to use satellite S-band for their telemetry and telecommand or even services.
Absolutely. So, look, I think one of the features of the Indian policy context is also just the lack of clarity even within the various departments and channels of the government itself. So, if you look at S-band I think is the poster child of this problem. So, if you go back in time, you will realize that at one point of time, Antrix had managed to work with a commercial entity to develop some services and some commercial solutions around the S-band, and then only for the Department of Telecom to come back and say that, look, licensing of spectrum is really our domain and not yours. And this is a precious spectrum resource. So how was it? How was this agreement even entered into with the commercial entity in the first place? So that then led to a whole bunch of internal to and fro, and before you know it, the contract awarded to the private sector player was cancelled. That led to an arbitration under the bilateral investment treaty. So long story short, spectrum has been problematic, not just because of this, but also because of the fact that in the 2G spectrum case, the Supreme Court just came back and said even if all the government departments are on board with this licensing of spectrum, if we detect some hanky-panky in the allocation process, we will strike it down. So ever since these bitter experiences with commercial utilization of spectrum started, there has been a significant amount of hurdle just to navigate the regulatory context and get access to the spectrum. So today my problem is that my equipment has to be certified by the standards of the Telecom Engineering Center of the Department of Telecom. My networks have to be validated by the NOCC. I have to work with the wireless planning and coordination wing of the DOT to get my spectrum access. They in turn have to ensure that ISRO and the Defense and the Ministry of Home Affairs are giving a NOC for it. The number of tables that I have to go to within the government to finally get to the end point of peacefully operating my network and my satellite, it's not a joke. And it essentially, the barriers of entry then become so high that it excludes a sizable part of the smaller and medium enterprises, and only the big players with the right kind of financial backing will be able to kind of navigate this kind of a policy landscape. So what we really need is for the government to really talk to each other in terms of its own agencies and departments, arrive at a consolidated single window clearance program, and ensure that there is complete clarity in terms of what is possible and what is not. So going back to your example of S-band, if tomorrow the government wants to come back and say, sorry, S-band is not available for the private sector, if that policy statement is made clearly, I think I'm okay with that, because I know now that it will be a futile exercise to even attempt that adventure. So my entire planning for the satellite mission can be around the non-availability of S-band. But if I don't have that level of policy clarity, I'm essentially operating with either a sense of hope that somewhere I'll get access to the S-band, or a sense of complete skepticism that will never happen, either of which is not healthy for my business planning purposes. So I think just in terms of aggregating the functions of the various departments of the government, making sure that they are on the same page, giving a clear policy statement as to what is available and what is not, what is possible and what is not, I think that would be one of the most significant areas of relief for the private industry. So I just hope that we get that kind of policy clarity, which today is actually quite difficult. And if I remember correctly, I think in 2011 there was even an article in the Hindu that said the DOS and the DOT are fighting about whether or not S-band can be made available to the private sector. So there is still a lot of internal consensus that is required even within the agencies of the state. And if as part of the announced reforms they're able to achieve that internal consensus and project the clarity from that consensus, that is a huge step in the right direction.
Absolutely, and you were talking about the frequency allocation, and there's also this national frequency allocation plan, and I don't know if there's any open consultation process for private space industry to voice their opinion to change the way it is being planned at the moment, to allow access to different frequencies in different bands for the private companies to then utilize them to operate spacecraft.
Absolutely. So the national frequency allocation plan at present, at least to my knowledge, goes back to 2018. and as of 2018, the in terms of a private space industry, the only insight into the private industry was through the policy of which is the SATCOM policy of 2000. So if I am a wireless planning and coordination wing of the government, or if I am the regulator, and I have to look at whether the private space industry is a relevant part of the ecosystem, so I take a look at the SATCOM policy, I take a look at the number of people who have applied for clearances for satellites under the SATCOM policy. And when that number is as disappointing as it is, as the Department of Telecom or the Wireless Planning and Coordination Wing, I am telling myself that while formulating the National Frequency Allocation Plan, the private space industry is probably not the most relevant stakeholder. I may probably go to the really big operators that are anyway kind of working with the Antrix, ISRO and NSIL ecosystem. But the smaller companies are probably not very relevant to the consultation process. So I think till now the problem has been that an uncertain policy translated to a largely irrelevant private space industry, and whatever little relevant space industry was there was a handful of big operators. But I think going forward, if the government is truly serious about developing in-house capacity in space and promoting space startups and incubating space technology within the country, they will have to bring this consultative process in a more meaningful manner. Because today, if a private space player comes to me and asks me, is a particular frequency range available for me to use, after going through the frequency allocation plan, I may still not be able to provide a clear answer as to whether the frequency range is available or not. I may go to the last spectrum allocation data and tell him that these are the ranges that have been auctioned. So therefore, the answer that I provide to my client is essentially what is not already auctioned to the private sector, as opposed to a clear answer as to whether a particular frequency range is available or not. So having that kind of a consultation process going forward would be a very significant step to ensuring that the reforms actually translate to an impact on the ground. If that consultation process does not happen for frequency allocation, you can bring in all the self-reliance policies in the world that you want to bring in, but it may still not translate to a thriving ecosystem within the country.
So when I look at it from a satellite manufacturing kind of a company perspective, I can have engineers design the satellite in India quite easily. I can possibly even manufacture it to a large extent within India. But if I want to launch it out of India, then I have to bear with this taxation policy that is out there, which is skewed if I want to launch using an Indian satellite or Indian rocket. And so therefore it's better for me to just go out and do that. But if I also want to then get the frequency allocation, then it's also not clear if it's legal for me to operate the spacecraft as an Indian company. So for these reasons, I guess it's better for an Indian company at the moment to set up a foreign subsidiary in Singapore or whichever country to, one, benefit from having frequency allocations much more convenient in a way. It's much more convenient for them to get these frequency allocations to operate their spacecraft and also benefit out of this launch stuff.
Absolutely. So, to summarize my answer, if today a company were to come back and tell me that we want to get into the business of satellites, right? So I would tell them that design and manufacture in India, set up a subsidiary company abroad which can arrange for a launch from a foreign launch service provider, and your customer segment has to be, ideally your customer segment should be abroad, so that your access to frequency and clearances for providing services will be much easier as opposed to being inside the country. So design, develop, manufacture in the country, launch outside, provide services outside, commercialize outside. I think that pretty much summarizes the best case scenario for a aspiring satellite operator within the country.
But what if some of these satellite operators want to provide a service within the country? Let's say there is a space-based, IoT provider. There's many of them around the world planning to do all these satellite-based IoT solutions. Is there enough, legal framework and policy framework available to them to operate within India today?
So is there a policy framework in which they can operate? Yes, absolutely. So for example, if you're a satellite service operator and you want to kind of provide your satellite or the transponders for IoT solutions, within the unified license regime of the Department of Telecom, there's always a provision for you to choose a category and try and make an application for a license under that category. But the only problem is that for you to get a successful license under that category, you have to first show that you have the frequency available for operating the license. Now that is a little bit of a vicious cycle, because if there's a fat chance that if I go and apply for a license to provide the IoT solutions, they will ask me, have you got access to the spectrum? And if I go to the wireless planning and coordination wing and I say that, look, I want to have access to the spectrum, they may very well come back and say, where is your service license? How do I know that you're actually going to use the spectrum to do something in the country? And then if I'm somehow able to get both of them to talk to each other within the very same department, they will probably come back and tell me that, look, everything is hunky-dory, you have complete go-ahead from our side, but you need to convince the guys from the Ministry of Home Affairs and the Ministry of Defense that, this is not going to be a problem for national security interests or for the defense requirements of the country. And so essentially, again, it just goes back to the same problem statement that yes, theoretically it is possible, but practically it's just a lot of communication and correspondences with the regulators, a constant follow-up, trying to make sure that you're speaking to the right people. And in the middle of all of this, the positive update is that sometime last November, the Department of Telecom came and announced that there is a new satellite division within the DOT. One of the mandates of the satellite division is to look at emerging technologies. So the hope is, although I don't know how this satellite division is working, that perhaps if your point of contact or entry into this regulatory ecosystem is through the satellite division, they might be able to better appreciate some of these nascent areas like IoT and then talk internally to the various departments and make sure that you get all the clearances you need. But right now, with what is available in public domain, just even something as simple as an IoT solution is not going to be easy. And I always cite the case study of how India needed Inmarsat services for maritime communication, defense communication, and disaster management communication. And when Inmarsat announced the transition of its technology from I think the earlier platform to iSat Phone Pro 3 platform, though it was very critical for defense forces, that entire process of just finding the right license category took quite a few years. And it took the intervention of the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India to come back and say that if there is a license category that doesn't work for the Inmarsat services, carve out a special license category for them in order to ensure that irrelevant conditions are not imposed. So if something as critical for India's national security took as long, something relevant only to the commercial sector like say IoT solutions is probably going to face a similar level of regulatory hurdles, if not something worse. So we need to really try and find ways to address this problem so that we can provide that sense of certainty and expediency to the whole licensing process.
For the purposes of this particular episode, we probably will stick to the rockets and satellites for now. And then, in the next episode, possibly again with you, we discuss more of the downstream segment, because I think there's enough, to discuss more on these two particular topics within the scope of this particular episode. So
sure.
In that sense, now, what can NewSpace do with this new reform that can benefit like seamlessly all these problems for people trying to build rockets and satellites in the country?
So if I have to speak from the point of view of the private industry, I think the ideal expectation or the best case scenario that we are looking at is for NewSpace to kind of aggregate the Department of Space, the Department of Telecom, the Wireless Planning and Coordination Wing, the Satellite Division of the DOT, aggregate all of those functions into one single body, so that all relevant perspectives from the space perspective to the telecom market perspectives can be injected into a single licensing program, right? So I think this will ensure that I don't have to go to too many people and places to kind of get my clearances, and it will also bring in a level of internal clarity for the government to realize what are the full range of concerns that have to be grappled with. So if NewSpace is just able to aggregate and consolidate the functions of the multitude of departments, institutions, and and agencies within the government, I think that itself would be a very big push in favor of the private industry. If I have to go a level further and kind of really become optimistic and hopeful, look, one of the significant areas of concern that I frequently hear from my clients in the private industry is if a foreign service provider or even an Indian service provider wants to step in and expects fairness and reasonable treatment when an application for license is provided, the expectation of reasonableness or non-arbitrary treatment, there is already a level of suspicion around it if the operator and the regulator are going to be the same people. So I think if you want to project that fairness and the non-arbitrariness and reasonableness in the approach to applications for licensing from private industry, you also need to remove any conflict of interest that can be perceived by the private industry in the licensing process. So just taking NSpace and making it a truly an institution or a regulatory body that is truly autonomous and independent of India's space agencies, I think is probably a big step in the right direction. And last but not the least, I think if I submit a license, I want to know the parameters based on which my application will be adjudicated. I want to know the timelines within which I'll get an answer as to whether it is a yes or a no. And I want some kind of a prediction in terms of how certain or uncertain this whole process is going to be. So I think if the government is able to address these three principal expectations, I would anticipate that will itself trigger a massive push for entrepreneurship in this sector.
From the recent announcement, of course, we know that NSpace is designed as an autonomous kind of a body that is still under the Department of Space. But we also know that the Secretary of the Department of Space is also the chairman of ISRO. And then, the Secretary of Department of Space is also perhaps will be overseeing NSpace. So how can all of this work in a way that there is no conflict of interest within the system?
So I think for me, if I have to take a very realistic and pragmatic view of this whole matter, yes, in an ideal world, we would want NSpace to be segregated and separated from these other Department of Space or the ISRO. But if it's realistically not possible and there's a constraint out there, I think we'll have to work with that. So the way the government can offset some of the concerns arising out of this close arrangement between NSpace and the India Space Program would be to ensure that the Space Activities Bill defines the functions, the powers and responsibilities of the NSpace body in such a clear and such a precise manner that we know that though it is embedded into the official space program of the country, the policy mandate is to operate without conflict of interest. Because what policy does is it does two things. One, it tells the regulator what is the extent of mandate they have and how much the policy of the legislature will back them up in case of any dispute tomorrow on the decision they take. But from the industry's point of view, I think when you have a policy that tells an NSpace to act in a certain manner, it gives you a benchmark to hold them accountable when they don't follow the mandate of the policy. So tomorrow, if NSpace is required by policy to operate without conflict of interest, and God forbid, and in the off chance that they actually happen to operate with conflict of interest, you now have a policy that gives you a right to challenge their decision-making process. So I think any kind of close proximity of NSpace with the regulatory bodies can be mitigated by a clear policy mandate that requires them to operate without conflict of interest. So I'm very curious to see how the Space Activities Bill will actually adapt in light of these developments and provide the level of assurance that is really necessary for us to know that this process will not repeat the history of the SATCOM policy.
One of the things that really shocks me in the process of all of this is that the traditional, legacy vendors of the Indian space program from the private sector, they are completely mute in this process.
So yeah, Look, at the end of the day, I think there is if I am one of those really big operators that have been embedded into the space program already, I think the level of trust that I have with the Indian government by virtue of my track record, by virtue of my credibility and that long working relationship, it's probably going it's probably going to address a lot of these concerns for me. It's probably going to offset a lot of these concerns for me already. So I'm not surprised that for them this is really not so much of an issue. I think the real area of promise or the real area of opportunity is to really give a space for the newer and the more emerging startups in the country to make a name for themselves. I think so. So policy is obviously a little bit more of a concern for the more nascent and the more smaller enterprises out there, because they have to build that credibility, they have to build that trust with the Indian space program. So from a policy point of view, you want to support the parties that most need that support. So I suppose that explains why the more embedded players out there have been quite mute about all of this.
So we know from some of the other sectors that normally, if there is no policy, frameworks that are available for some of these companies to be successful, let's say e-commerce or many other sectors that are technology-driven sectors, and companies have kind of gone around and had foreign subsidiaries and used all sort of kind of getting out in puzzles in making sure that they are successful. And my view of all of this is that any of these developments within InSpace or the recent developments in terms of reforms will not be very progressive. That at least is my position in all of this. And I think for some of these companies to be kind of successful, they will have to demonstrate that using like foreign presence is what I believe, because it's just the nature of how a country like India operates and how laws get done in India, I suppose. What do you think about this?
So, see, I think if you look at space law as a subject, I mean, you can divide it into two categories, right? Which is international space law, from the Outer Space Treaty to the domestic space laws, which could be the Commercial Launch Act of the US, or it could be the upcoming InSpace brand of policy in India. Now, I think the opportunity or the challenge is that even at an international scale, there is very little consensus to the minute specifics of what is an acceptable commercial space activity and what is not. So that opaqueness in the international sector also has kind of either enabled or detracted the players in the space industry, whatever way you decide to look at it. Now, from an Indian point of view, I think the problem is that my fear is that we may probably not be very pragmatic in our position under international space law itself. You have countries like Luxembourg and the USA that's already coming back and saying that we are going to make an honest effort at commercially exploiting outer space bodies. They're looking to create enabling domestic policies that motivate and encourage and validate businesses that are looking to mine asteroids out there. But within Indian policy circles, I think there is still that very admirable idealistic approach to space as for the peaceful exploration of all mankind, for trying to really satisfy our existential curiosity about why we are on this earth and in the larger scheme of the universe. So I think there is a certain drive towards a more idealistic approach to international space law as opposed to the more pragmatic approach that other countries are taking. Look, I mean, neither approach is right or wrong. I think where we stand, from a pure philosophical point of view, there's really no quarrel with India's approach to be very traditional in its approach to international space law. But if the slated objective is that we want to be able to unleash the potential of the private sector, then unfortunately taking that kind of a traditional and a very idealistic approach to international space law is going to give rise to its own share of policy constraints. So today, with this kind of a international policy vision translating to a restricted domestic policy context, and a private enterprise aspiring to enter into the sector of space would be better served going abroad and trying to work with some of the more practically oriented countries as opposed to being in a country like India, which is still very idealistic in terms of how it approaches the theater of space. So you're right. I think with the present policy context, I think it may be inevitable that we look at more and more Indian space companies going abroad to really find the success that they want. But that said, I mean, I tend to be an optimist. I still feel that the in-space brand of reforms might actually turn the tide in our favor. So let's see how it goes.
I strongly believe that the pioneers of who will look at all of this as a successful enterprise will probably have to do this first step of going abroad, because ultimately the government needs to realize that it is losing tax revenue, it's losing on creating the jobs that it can create within in the Indian borders, and I guess it'll be a reflection of that which will drive changes in the policies and not anything before. That's at least my stance on this.
I agree with you 100%. I think the government really needs to understand that it's no longer just a fun activity, right? I mean, now space is a proper business. So we are looking at large constellation of LEO satellites emerging. We are looking at traditional businesses in the field of e-commerce now suddenly deciding to enter into the domain of space. We are looking at our own reliance, in fact, acquiring stakes in space-based businesses. So space is going to be a vehicle for commerce, and it's not a case where it's a low yield economic activity. I mean, we are talking about high investments, high returns, and if I just go back to the example of what Finland did after World War II. To pay off the duty towards war reparations to Russia, they actually focused on technology intensive industry so that the margins are higher, and they were able to kind of become economic power to reckon with only because of that kind of an approach. So I think India really must start looking at space as a vehicle for driving economic growth, for realizing greater tax revenues, for creating jobs, for promoting innovation, and we know now that the spin-off benefits from space technology can have a lot of terrestrial benefits as well. So just in terms of being able to appreciate the new normal, which is what commercial space is all about, India would stand to benefit significantly if they were able to shift from being a purely idealistic country in space law to a more pragmatic and a more industry-oriented spacefaring nation. And I think that is probably the motivation behind the recent reforms as well. So I'm keeping my fingers crossed that we will see this actually translate to the kind of benefits we are looking for the industry.
Do you get a sense of how the consultation process for in-space to will happen for reforms in India? Because we have only seen the announcement come up, and after that there is not really any announcements on any open consultation process.
So I mean, I can only speculate here because unfortunately I've not been really embedded into the policy level discussions at the state level. But I would presume that in view of the in-space was not as a body was not contemplated under the earlier space activities bill of 2017. So you don't see the word in-space feature in that. So I'm assuming that the basic policy vision and intent has probably changed significantly in light of the recent announcements. So the next step would be for them to come up with an altogether new draft of the space activities bill to kind of accommodate some of these recent announcements. Once that draft is probably ready, I think the inevitable next step would be to throw it open for public consultations. And I would hope they do that, and I think that will be part of the natural policy making process. But I'm thinking that until the revised and updated space activities bill draft is available, that kind of public consultation may probably not just yet happen, but I'm sure it will happen in the days to come.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of want to challenge you on that, because I think it may be better if the open consultation process happens first and then they do the drafting.
Ideally, yes, that would have been the much better way of going about it. But knowing how legislations work in this country, I mean, not just space, but everything non-space as well. The initial draft is always probably done with behind closed doors by a lot of members of the bureaucracy, and then as part of the further processes of converting the bill into the legislation, there are multiple levels of consultations that open up. But yeah, ideally, as you rightly pointed out, I would have ideally wanted to be part of the consultation ahead of the draft itself. But if I have to really look at the advantage of this approach, when I get the first draft from the state and what language it employs will tell me a lot about how the eventual space policy will actually be interpreted. So if, for example, all these announcements of InSpace is made, but tomorrow the first draft of the policy still looks at it in the same level of opaqueness and the restrictiveness that the industry has been complaining, then probably is just a new brand but the same problem. But if the new draft that comes out has a shift in the language that it employs, then I know that it's not just a policy intent, but the government is willing to walk the talk. So I think the lack of consultation also gives us a way to measure the approach of the state. And I mean, I am a huge fan of the Indian space program. I'm a huge fan of the ISRO. So something tells me that, but this time around, we will be able to expect the right kind of outcomes. So let's see.
In the meantime, what do you think the companies which are in India operating and trying to build these rockets and satellites can do? Because of course, you and I are kind of conversing this in a very open fashion, and we can afford to do so because we have very little to lose between just the two of us. But I guess, it's not something that is usual for many of these companies to come out and say openly that this is what we want. So I have been always critical of the entire new space community in that front, saying there's not enough, banding together and coming together to kind of create a list of requirements and putting it out more independently.
So yeah, I mean, see, there I can understand the apprehension of being a little more vocal in terms of what the policy expectations are. But look, at the end of the day, the way democracies work is that you are likely to get the policy you want only if you are able to express that this is the policy that you actually are looking for. So I see what you mean. I think one significant concern is that even within the members of the industry, there seems to be a lack of consensus on what the policy should actually look like. So there is still a lot of need for new space companies in the country to kind of come together on a platform, form an association of sorts that can lobby and petition for the right kind of benefits for the industry as a whole. So there is still a lot of work that companies themselves have to do in terms of becoming more mature and becoming more communicative with the government. The other problem that I've frequently seen in the space industry is that look, I mean, there is a certain maturity and experience that is needed to be able to communicate with the government the right kind of manner. So we can't have a situation where an industry representative goes to the government and says that your insurance requirements for a launch contract is too onerous, you need to get rid of it. Because then you lose credibility, right? If you're going to go to the government and say that I want to be in space, I want to do a high-risk activity like space, but I'm not willing to make the commitment by taking insurance for the launch contract, as the industry as a whole loses credibility in the process, and I know for a fact that these instances have happened. So I think there is a lot to be done from the industry point of view to not just become technically very sound, which it already is, but to also develop the right kind of public relations exercises, to develop a highly mature and a formal government relations exercise, build that sense of credibility, not just in terms of your technical expertise, but also in terms of the business models you have in mind and just the sensitivity towards the concerns of the state. So I think the new space industry can do a lot to organize itself better, learn to ask for what it wants in a much more formal, much more clear and a generally more professional tone and tenor. I think if they're able to invest in these processes and work with some of the people who have already been there and done that, I think there is a fat chance that the lack of seriousness that is being given to them right now may probably change. But that's a lesson mostly for the industry and not for the government. I think that's a lesson for all of us. So I'm hoping that some of the younger businesses will start to grow in the process and become a little more mature and just develop those skills of diplomacy necessary to be able to negotiate and get some of these concessions.
One of the things that I noticed, at least for the long time now, is that procurement is something that needs to be fixed in the system. Because I was also having a chat with General Menon, for example, on procurement of space-based services for the armed forces, and he was of the view that currently the system is in a way where the armed forces indicate what is their requirement, and then ultimately it's for the government to use either DRDO or ISRO to then provide that requirement. And so you have this barrier that the private industry cannot access end users in the government directly for space-based services. So even these are, I think, issues that are not, really related to like the functioning of the industry. It may not be related to how licensing is done or how frequencies are allocated, but these are really issues of how the ease of doing business and how the space economy within India can be developed, and which needs a real fix for all of this. So do you think that InSpace will have an any outlook on all of this, or is this just too broad for them to like look at it?
So, I mean, let's take a very specific part of that question, right? Which is our defense user base and their access to space-based services. If I remember correctly, I think there's a story that goes back to the Kargil War, which speaks about how our requirement for satellite images was actually had to be fulfilled by a foreign vendor at a very short time frame. So we actually had to buy images at a significant escalation of cost. And even if I take a look at some of our fighter jet acquisition programs, there was that 125 fighter jet program that the previous government announced, and then that became a government-to-government procurement of Rafale aircraft. And now, ever since the recent clashes with China, we are seeing massive acquisition exercises for fighter jets, for missiles, and a whole bunch of other critical defense technology. So this problem of procurement for the defense forces, and it is such a critical subject because you want your soldiers to be able to get the best at the best of technology at the right kind of time frames. That entire subject is covered by a very different procurement document, which is the defense procurement procedure. Now, the defense procurement procedures, like a lot of other public procurement procedures in the country, has multiple layers of clearances and processes and vetting before a product is actually approved for acquisition by the armed forces. So I would presume that access to satellite services, say for communication purposes or for satellite data, will probably still be the same problem statement, which is that it will have to go through the defense procurement procedures. And I don't think InSpace will be able to operate into that domain because of how sensitive it is for our defense requirements, and the level of autonomy that our forces will need to be able to pick the right kind of technology for the right price and at the right time frames. So I think that will still be a problem statement for the procurement procedures of the defense forces to address, and not InSpace. But they are connected because I think if for example InSpace and the Ministry of Defense are able to work together, they may be able to incubate say a fleet of remote sensing satellites, a fleet of satellite communication SATCOM satellites. So they may be able to incubate some of these newer companies that can provide these kind of critical satellite services. And if they're able to combine the incubation program with a buyback guarantee, that will also then incentivize industries to kind of really make a shift towards working with procurement procedures. And it will tie in well with the Make in India initiative as well. So I don't see InSpace really doing much there. I think that's mostly for the Ministry of Defense and the armed forces to kind of take a step forward. But knowing how critical space technology is for terrestrial conflict, I would assume that this will be a significant area of interest for defense forces, and the sooner they're able to develop clarity on how they wish to work with the private sector, I think the easier it will be for them to make the necessary to put the necessary procurement procedures in place. So let's see how that develops in the days to come.
Right, I think we had quite a long chat about all of this, and I want to put you into a spot before I end this episode. So, in that sense, I just wanted to ask you, what do you see as a future? 5 years from now, where do you see all of this going, and what is the picture that you want to paint 5 years from now?
So the idealist in me tells me that we will have a thriving market for space industry. We will see our own indigenous launch technology providers. We will see our own satcom industry challenge the best and the largest in the world. We will have the finest remote sensing fleet of satellites from the private sector. But if I have to really temper down my own optimism and look at it more realistically, I think 5 years from now, the market will probably be most ripe for downstream services more than upstream services. I mean, that just comes from the data about how slow the upstream industry reforms have been in the last couple of years. So if I was an entrepreneur focused on space, I would probably look at how the existing birds in the sky can probably be better optimized for requirements on the ground. How it can tie into national security requirements, how it can be used to meet national interests, how it can make the lives of farmers better, because all of that will tie into the political economy around space. So for me, downstream seems to be the low-hanging fruit, and I think 5 years from now we will see a very robust and a very friendly regulatory regime towards downstream services that is actually delivering impact and not just looking like policies on paper. So 5 years from now, my anticipation and my bet is on the downstream industry. Upstream, I think we will have to do some amount of work to really translate policy promises into actual action on the ground. But downstream for me, I mean, if I have to invest, downstream would definitely be the place for me.
Ashok, this has been an insightful episode on thinking about how legal it is to build satellites and rockets in India, and how to make companies, satellites and rockets, companies building satellites and rockets successful in India. Thank you very much for being a guest on the show, and I look forward to doing another episode that completely focuses on the downstream elements and the policies and laws around it, and how to scale that up within the Indian context with you.
Thank you for having me over, NP. It was an absolute pleasure speaking about this with you, and let's hope for the best, and let's hope that the slated reforms meet the objectives that they have in mind. Thank you for having me again.